Lacho dives Romalen. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I am Maria Dumitru and I'm pleased to be your host in this afternoon discussion in the Permanence of Anti-Roma Racism and Other Sentences book. This event is part of the Meet Our History campaign organized by CHANIPEN, which aim is to share and visibilize our history, the history of Romani people. And this month, we focus on the Romani slavery in the two Romanian principalities, Moldova and Wallachia, present Romania. 20 February marks the 170 years since the slavery abolition, and at the end of this event we will share a Romani-led proclamation where both Dr. Matache and myself contributed. We cannot talk today about racism and racial inequalities without looking at the history of enslavement, and there is no better day than today to reclaim the Romani justice, reparation, and dignity. So in this occasion, we will have the book to discuss, we will have the opportunity to discuss this amazing book that Margareta Matache have written, and she speaks all about these things. So this book has been acclaimed as a groundbreaking study that provides significant and critical contributions to the understanding of the Romani narratives, particularly in the context of anti-Roma racism. It integrates multiple disciplines. It integrates research methodologies to establish a rigorous framework of knowledge and theoretical analysis. All of these have been done in exploring the historical oppression that Romani people have been suffering not just in Romania, but also in Europe. We are honored to have Dr. Matache with us. She's a friend, colleague, and an inspiration for many of us. Magda, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone.
Allow me now to say a couple of words about Dr. Margareta Matache. So Dr. Matache is a lecturer on social and behavioral sciences at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She's also a co-founder and director of the Roma program at FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University, and she's a member of the Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health. In 2017, she co-edited a book called Realizing Roma Rights, which is an investigation about anti-Roma racism in Europe in collaboration with Jacqueline Baba and Andrei Mirga. She also co-edited the Time for Reparation volume in 2021, where she explored issues of reparations across a broad range of historical and geographical contexts and different disciplines, all along with Jacqueline Baba and Caroline Elkins. So overall, she has 25 years of experiences where in her work she examined the manifestations and impacts of racism across political and geographical contexts. So thank you so much for being here with us, Magda. We are not alone. We have two amazing discussants, two brilliant scholars from the critical thinking, and I would like to welcome Dr. Ismael Cortez and PhD candidate Sebian Feijula. Thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure.
Thank
you. For having us, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And I will read now their bio. Shall I start with Ismael, right? Yes. So Dr. Ismael Cortez is a postdoctoral fellow at the Research Center on Anti-Gypsyism at Heidelberg University, Germany. He is also an associate professor at International Master's Program in Peace, Conflict, and Development Studies at University Jaume I. He served as a board member of European and Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, and he is also a former member of Spain Congress of Deputies and policy advisor in the European Parliament. We think that in this conversation, Dr. Cortez brings both legislative and academic insights. Welcome. I would also like to introduce Sebian Feijula. It's an anti-racist militant and a PhD candidate in human rights at the University of Coimbra, Portugal. She's a former researcher at the Center for Social Studies and co-editor of a book, State Racism, a collective view from the perspective of autonomy and racial justice. Her scholarship interrogates European modernity, state racism, structural anti-Roma racism, and Roma political autonomy. She's also a co-founder of Kalea Menge, Roma for Ourselves, advocating for Roma political emancipation. Sebi brings in this discussion a critical, decolonial, feminist, and emancipatory perspective. Welcome, Sebi, and welcome all of you. Thank you so much for being here. And now that I have introduced the three of you, I would like to invite Magda to share some insights and present her book. Magda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maria. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the invitation, Fernando and Maria. I am incredibly grateful to and excited about CHANIPEN, a vibrant new Roma-led organization that is putting our Romani history and knowledge production out there in the world through our own voices and our perspectives. So thank you. And a big thank you as well to Sebi and Ismail for joining this conversation today when we mark a major moment in the history of Romani resistance. 170 years of Roma freedom from enslavement, 170 years since the abolition of a racialized system of slavery in Romania. Now, maybe I can start with the whys and how I decided to write this book. And like many Romani people, I grew up feeling that there were stories I didn't know that shape my family and communities. Stories that might have explained the world I was born into. But at times, those stories echoed in fragments. For instance, my dad, to whom I dedicated this book, used to listen to banned anti-dictatorial radio stations during the Ceausescu regime. So this vague notion of rebellion was a part of my early childhood. And later, after communism collapsed, he became involved in Romani activism. And I often heard him in our own yard talking to other activists about police violence, communal violence against Roma, migration waves, discrimination in schools, systemic disinvestment in segregated Romani communities, and so on. And to understand these echoes and fragments, I've addressed and studied anti-Roma racism pretty much throughout my adult life. But this book began from a different yet similarly personal starting point, really a longing for a family history I had never learned, I had never had. And in fact, my great-grandparents were the primary focus behind these 8 years of archival and research work, years spent reading and rereading, learning, unlearning, writing and rewriting. So those of you, all of you here in the room are writers, you know what I'm talking about. But while exploring my family history, I did not really anticipate what I would discover. And please allow me to share a few lines from chapter 2 of the book to clarify what I mean. Quote, I was born in 1978, legally free. Yet a few generations earlier, my maternal forefathers and foremothers, born and raised in the same area in southern Romania, were not that fortunate. When my great-grandparents Maria Nicolae Petre and Marin Ioana Ghiță married legally on Monday, May 28, 1906, their marriage certificate referred to them as emancipated Romanians. That phrase was an inherited hierarchical social and legal label, a formal reenactment, and the reminder that the violence the abolition claimed to have overcome. It must have been unsettling for them to have Gajikane civil servants presiding over their marriage, penning that label, and silently reinforcing themselves as the masters, while viewing Roma merely as individuals to whom they recently conferred humanity. So when I found that marriage certificate, I not only understood, but more so felt the labels placed on my ancestors, and how they were more than bureaucratic markers or biases. They are really tools of power to a large extent. So their role was to split people into hierarchies, humans and non-humans, superior and inferior, castes and outcasts, for gain, wealth, power, and prestige. Those labels also were also meant to help conceal the resistance, work, dignity, lives, stories, and the humanity of our ancestors. But in writing this book, I had to face not only the past, or better said, its erasure, but also to challenge the canons and history I had learned and internalized from this mainstream Gajikano world. Everything around me has been shaped by Western, patriarchal, gender normative, heteronormative, classist, and ableist norms. And at the same time, I carried so many doubts about whether I could undertake such work. And I hoped then, and I still do now, that this work, this book, contributes to the widening of the Roma archive, the European archive, and the global archive. And in many ways, this book is my insistence that our histories and stories and intellectual label be recognized as part of the conversations on systems of oppression, from the local to the global. And it is important to acknowledge that alongside my own family history, the readings, spaces, theories, and conversation I have been fortunate to engage across continents and across disciplines have also given me the courage to write. But several times people have asked me about the title of this book, and I want to talk a little bit about it, particularly because it combines tribute theory, but also protest. The idea of unuttered sentences is a tribute to the Romani poet Desider Banga, whose verses I discuss in the book, and more broadly to a tribute to Romani writers. It is really my attempt to utter sentences that help restore fragments of Roma history, realities, and culture that have been silenced and spoken about only by Gage. Permanence signals not only continuity over time, but also the way oppression regenerates, adapts, and also modernizes. Anti-Roma racism does not simply persist, it reorganizes itself, finding new institutional forms, new languages, and new justifications. I also want to bring up some of these books' intended contributions. I may have not reached them, but this is how I intended to be received. First, I conceptualize racialization from a Roma and structural perspective. In many ways, I try to engage in a Romanization of this concept. And I understand racialization, as many other scholars, as a process that constructs difference, that turns difference into hierarchy and hierarchy into exclusion and inequities. It continually shapes who is recognized as fully human and who is not. Looking at Roma history through this lens, in the book I talk about 4 recurring and interrelated features of racialization. I talk first of all about categorization, homogenization, and eternalization of Romani people as a group. Then I talk about myth-crafting, relational racialization, and absolute racialization. And probably I can take just a minute to explain each of them briefly. So I think when it comes to categorization, I talk about biocentric, theocentric, and culture-centric classifications that have ranked Romani people and Romani culture as inferior or savage. And we can see this in legal texts, church documents, academic writings, journalisms, and so on since our arrival in Europe. In conceptualizing myth crafting, I build a lot on the work of anti-racist scholars who have framed race as the witchcraft of our time, or frame the concept of race crafting. And in relation to that, I add myth crafting as a component of racialization. So I described myth crafting as a social and power process that constructs collective harmful traits and behaviors, especially the myth of collective criminality, which we can see everywhere in the world. In the United States, we still use the expression to be gypped, which comes from the idea of gypsy criminality. But these myths are not innocent. They legitimize surveillance, violence, discriminatory policies, and everyday refusal to live, eat, or share space with Romani people. It also provides ethical, religious, and emotional justification for Gage when they see unjust behaviors, unjust actions, unjust laws and policies that target Romani people. And then I look at relational racialization, which describes how tropes and myths move beyond different racialized groups. And these analogy, I also argue that are not incidental. So when you use tropes against Romani people to describe Jewish people or Black people or Palestinian people, this is not incidental, and the other way around. These analogies shape police practices, border regimes, media narratives, and public policy across borders and time. And essentially, they show that racisms, if we were to think about various racisms in different countries and to use the concept of Francesco Betancourt of racisms, they are not isolated phenomena, but part of a shared global system. And it's important for us to place anti-Romani racism, this form of oppression, in that global system. And then finally, I theorize absolute racialization, where I analyze what I call, what I called also absolute dehumanization, because I'm talking about moments when Roma are legally and socially treated as property, as non-beings who can be bought, sold, donated, and killed with impunity. And here, of course, we can talk about the case of the system of slavery in Romania, but we can also look at other, major episodes of genocide and violence against Romani people. Probably, another contribution of the book is an examination of the genesis of the oppression and placing the genesis of anti-Roma racism in late medieval and early modern Europe, as opposed to placing the genesis of this racism in the race theories of the 18th and 19th century, or the Holocaust and or fascism and so on. So what I argue is that European sovereigns pursued two predominant projects of violence in response to Roma migration in the European territories. In the principalities of Moldova and Wallachia, and Maria Dumitru talked about this, beginning in the 1300s and probably earlier, but we do not have, our own records of it. Those in power seized Roma people into a institutionalized and racialized system of slavery that lasted for about 5 centuries. Roma bodies became legally owned and inherently property. But elsewhere in Europe, authorities pursued a different but equally violent project centered on spatial purity and monopoly. So many empires and cities and small states issued edicts of expulsion and prohibition, launched these organized hunts known as gypsy hunts, carried on executions and roundups and forced displacement and ghettoization in order to cast Roma out of empires, provinces, towns, villages, and neighborhoods. And these early projects of violence have set patterns in law, policies, politics, economics, theology, and everyday practice that inform how Roma are still governed today. So these early practices anchor the permanence that the book describes. And maybe I can take another minute to mention that beyond these origins, the book engages with the underpinnings and protectors of anti-Roma racism throughout time. So by protectors and underpinnings, I really mean the forces that keep this system in place across political regimes and historical moments and across geographies. And I argue that anti-Roma racism is repeatedly sustained by racialization and gajones, so human hierarchies and doctrines of superiority, the erasure of Roma people, culture, and history from official narratives and from spaces around us, bodily and institutional violence, exclusionary politics and policymaking, and what I conceptualize as apartness, looking basically at separation both in everyday life and organized apartness through the mechanisms of law, culture, and so on. And finally, in the book, I argue and I try to place Romani history and more so this structural oppression in global conversation. So I argue that our Romani stories, the history and voices of those who grew up as members of this local and global cultural group, voices that have been typically minimized and erased, belong in local, national, European, and global histories. Our histories and voices belong to the local and global theories and studies of racism, racialization, structural violence, genocides, the Holocaust, racialized slavery, systems of oppression, and so on. And our history and voices belong to the local and global theories and studies of racial capitalism, structural violence, patriarchy, ableism, heteronormativity, queer phobia, and other systems of oppression. So essentially, while I look at this, I also argue that our struggles as a people, as a group, are tied to the global histories of oppression and the global fight for justice. And I will stop here, and I really, like to thank you all once again, and to thank Sebi and Ismail for taking the time to read my book and for participating in this book discussion. And I truly value your thoughts, reflections, critique, and any questions you may have. And Maria Dumitru, I hope you contribute to this discussion, as you have already read my book as well. And I would really look forward to your critique, particularly because you come from a feminist perspective in understanding slavery in Romania, and I would love to hear your critique about how the book reflects that dynamic or not. So thank you all so much.
So thank you so much, Magda. Thank you for this presentation. It was absolutely fascinating to hear you and to learn how many efforts you have put it in this work. I also had the opportunity to read your book, and I will be very happy to participate in the conversation as well. But allow me now to first invite our discussants and distinguished guests today to respond, to reflect, to critique, to build on what they have read. So yes, so if we start with Sebi, that will be great. Sebi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Magda, for in such short time introducing the main concepts of the book I wrote to you yesterday. This is an incredible book, one of the most important books that's going to serve to us, to our children, to our grandchildren, and to everyone. And we are very hopeful with this book, with this narrative. Before I begin, I want to honor the voices that animate the book, the ancestor whose fingerprints, names, and stories Dr. Margareta Matache has resurrected from the ashes of silence. Let me share a few of their truths. I was working on the estates of the boyars, the author's godmother explaining why she never went to school in the 1940s. A little Roma girl told me that she doesn't want to be black like her mother, but she wants to be blonde with blue eyes to be beautiful. My grandmother Florea learned to sew from her mother, passing down the skills to my own mother, who then carried on the tradition. But along with that singer machine came another inheritance. Florea sewed clothes not only for money, but also in exchange for food. Her children continued to work on the estates of the boyars from a young age, the author tracing how the violence of enslavement echoes through generations. They must have been pretty bold rebels to marry that old. He was almost 28 and she was 22. The author's laughing at her great-grandparents' marriage certificate before remembering the weight of the label besides their names, emancipated Romanians. I began with these testimonies because one of the book's most radical arguments is that Roma lived experience is not merely evidence of suffering. It is theory, it is critique, it is knowledge produced through bodies that have carried the weight of a design system of oppression for centuries. The author's godmother explaining why she never went to school speaks a truth that no archive can capture, that the boyar estates, the same estates where her ancestors were enslaved, continue to extract her labor generation after abolition. The single sentence echoes what Ahmed Cesaria argued about the boomerang effect of oppression, that the violence of Europeans served for others would eventually return to Europe itself. But here the author extends the critique inward, showing how intracontinental exploitation of Roma never needed to leave the continent to operate with colonial brutality. The little Roma girl who wishes for blue eyes and blonde hair has already internalized what racial science, Enlightenment philosophy, and centuries of European cultural production have inscribed onto her body, that her blackness marks her as ugly, as less, as outside the human. When Arthur de Gouvernet stamped us as pariahs in the hierarchy of races, when Francis Galton named us as alongside Mongolians, Jews, Black and American Indians, as population with distinct inferior character and intellect, they were writing the ideology that would reach this child in Romanian classrooms centuries later. And when Immanuel Kant and the Enlightenment philosopher built theories on universal rights, while simultaneously endorsing racial hierarchies, they ensured that beauty, reason, and humanity would always be coded white. The singer sewing machine passed down through generations carried not only a craft but a material trace of enslaved women who sewed in exchange for food, their skills marketed in advertisements for slaves, their labor stolen alongside their freedom. When Magda reads Mikhail Kogalnicenaus, I'm sorry my pronunciation, 1837 description of Atrashi women sewing in boyar courtyards, when she traces her own grandmother Florea back through Maria Uta and Tuderana, generation of women who could not read or write, but whose hands kept families alive, she is doing what Hartman's called critical fabulation, resurrecting lives from the silences of the archive. And she's answering Walter Johnson's call to take Roma history as another starting point for rethinking the history of the world, placing her family's story alongside the Black radical tradition of Du Bois, who named the color line as the problem of the 20th century. The author's laughter at the great-grandparents' marriage certificate before she sees the words emancipated Romanians stamped beside their names captured precisely what this book exposes, The way joy and love have always existed inside the system designed to crush us, and the way the system continues to write itself onto our most intimate moments. This moment echoes Frantz Fanon's insight that oppression is epidermalized, written onto the screen, internalized into the psyche, but also his insistence that the colonized never fully accepted their dehumanization. These testimonies are not warm-up stories before the real analysis begins. These are the analyses. They embody the book's central critique, that liberal anti-racism, the framework Magnus Hirschfeld developed in response to Nazism, which locates racism in irrational beliefs that education can cure, failed because it cannot hear what a child's wish for blue eyes reveals about the permanence of racialized hierarchy. They reveal what epistemic violence, what Spivak called the silencing of the subaltern, is not abstract, but lives in the gaps between grandmother's sewing and granddaughter's university degree. When the author walks to Cosia Monastery and finds an enslaved Roma man's face sculpted into a fontaine with no plaque, no name, no history, she's witnessing what Michel Roll described as the power of silence in history making. Some stories are not simply forgotten, but actively buried. When Surai Jung then names Roma among the global outcasts, he invites us into solidarity with the Dalit struggle, a solidarity this book makes urgent and undeniable. Amy Cesarier insisted that decolonization is not reform, but the creation of a new humanity. This book, through these voices, finally utters our sentences, and in doing so, joins this radical tradition, claiming our place in the story of human liberation. For me, this book is also an interruption and disruption to Eurocentric Gajicanet system of power and knowledge about us. So at this moment, I can only say thank you very much, dear Magda, for returning to us what was stolen, not just our history, but our right to dream, to heal, and to define our own liberation on our own terms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebi, for responding and for your reflection. That was absolutely intense and also very theoretical, although it carries a lot of emotions right there, because we all share the commonalities of experiencing anti-racism on our very own skin. So thank you for that. I will now like to invite as well Dr. Ismael Cortes to respond, to reflect, to critique, to build on what he had learned. So Ismael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thank you, Magda, for contributing with this very important piece of knowledge to the common heritage of the Romani people in Europe and in the Americas. So I have a first question for you, and it's, why do you think that the history of Romani slavery in Romania has been erased from the European memory, but also from the Romanian and the European educational curricula? And linked to that, I wanted to make you a question about the methodology. Yeah, what drove you? What was the driver that pushed you to choose this type of methodology, this type of intimacy when you're writing the history of an entire people, but also the history of Europe, yeah, with this strategy of building or reconstructing your own family story, your own ancestry, and from there, the genealogy of a people, the Romani people, the genealogy of a country, Romania, and a continent, Europe. And then how easy or how difficult was for you to combine like empirical archival research with what you call in chapter 2, the critical fabulation. And this is what I really found it fascinating, how you really balance risky exercise, yeah, this type of doing historiography on the one hand, and on the other hand, a mixture of literature, narration, fabulation, playing with the imagination, and at the same time pure evidence-based research. One more question or comment is, how do you see the differences between gadgetness and whiteness? Yeah, because I don't think we can establish an equivalent between the division blackness and whiteness and gypsiness, gadgetness. Yeah, because it goes beyond skin color. Yeah, these are histories and legacies of institutionalization in the pure ethnic relations in Romania and beyond. And then going deeper into the typologies of racialization, how do you see that there are similarities and divergences in the form that slavery was constituted and developed, as you very rightly pointed out, in the late medieval times and European modernity with the colonial regimes? Yeah, because this is such a divergent point. The Romani slavery in Romania was in a certain way different than slavery of the Roma in Spain. Yeah, because the slavery of Roma in Spain was, of course, in the late medieval times linked to the nation building process, but then an entire new dynamic entered into the scene with the colonization of the Americas. But that wasn't the case in Romania. Yeah, but still we can find some kind of similarities and differences. And then when you talk about a caste system in Romania, to what degree do you think that this is still a permanent social structure in Romania? To what degree this is still embedded in the Romanian society and also in the state structures? Where do you see that? Yeah. And one last question. Of course, you pointed out very courageously the issue of gadget privilege in the European societies and particularly the Romanian society. But there is one more thing that is also what I call the gadget solidarity. Yeah, there is a kind of solidarity between white people and then in our case between the gadget people that make us weak. Yeah, vis-a-vis the ethnic relations and the ethnic clashes and conflict. And I wonder how much the entire market of slavery reinforced that gadget solidarity, because it wasn't only the state who owned Romanian Romani slaves. It wasn't only the church, but it was also private landowners. Yeah, so it was an entire system of trafficking with Romanian slaves that make the Romanian society be cohesive, yeah, in social terms, but also in economic terms. And this was a kind of bondage in terms of solidarity between the gadget society. And then there are all the elements of racialization, the dehumanization of the slave, and how create an entire gradation of human lives. Yeah, I think that's all from my side, and I really enjoy reading this book. I think should be translated in different languages.
I agree. Definitely, Ismael, it should be translated. It should be read. We all will learn so much from this book. Thank you so much, Ismael, for your comments, your questions, your reflections. I would like now to invite Magda to respond, to also reflect on what she heard, both from you and from Sebi. So Magda, if you would like to proceed with the comments, the floor is yours.
Of course, and thank you so much. This is, brilliant, your amazing feedback. So, as I expected from both of you, because you are, some of the scholars that I I admire and respect a lot. So thank you. It means a lot to me to even have you here, and more so to to have you read the book. And I'll start probably with some of Sebi's comments. And I was glad that I had the moment to breathe, because in many moments you made me cry. By by listening to you. And I think this whole idea of family stories and family histories as theory, as analysis, which you've taken out as one of the main points in the book, is so important to me, because in many ways you may have seen that I didn't necessarily look at European scholarship, um, especially modern white European scholarship. I wanted to theorize based on what I learned from my own family and from my own communities, and to put these lessons in conversation with global theories that are more decolonial, anti-racist, and so on. So I'm so grateful to you for the way in which you reframed much of that piece of work, and you are putting it in much more beautiful words. So thank you so much for that. I think that one element that I wanted to bring also up from your comments, Sebi, is your references to MS is there, and then I think we can talk also about Fanon and Gramsci more so, and this conversation, which is old but is so new, about the need for a new humanity, right? So we are in a moment when we are seeing that the world is not functioning, and probably we can frame it in relation to racial capitalism and this, neo-feudalism system where the wealthy run the whole world, and I think it's so blunt in our face now. So how do we create a new humanity by going through this moment of crisis where we are in? And I think that Gramsci and Césaire and Fanon, were in a similar moment in thinking about a new humanity. And I think that this new humanity is one where Romani people, first of all, are seen through their humanity more so than anything else. Now, I think there are many questions that that Ismail has posed, and thank you so much. They are amazing, and I'll try to at least comment on a few of them so that we can give some space for comments and questions from our audience. I think that your first question was why is it that slavery has been erased from local, national, European, and global histories, and it's not just histories, everything that is related to the symbols that we see, the movies that we watch, the books that we read, the textbooks that we have in schools. And I think that going back to Sebi's comment about Walter Johnson's question at the Roma conference, so we are talking about one of the most well-known scholars of slavery in the world, and yet she was the one discovering this history through the voices of Romani scholars and activists who were present at the Roma conference back in 2015 or 2016. I don't recall the exact year. So I think it's very much related to power, and it's very much related to the connection between power and knowledge production. And we see this in every system of oppression. And of course, Romania, in building its nation state and constructing nationalism, had an interest in telling the history from the perspective of the victor, right? This is what history books do in most countries. If you were to read the history of Romania from the perspective of Hungary and the other way around, we can see how perspectives are different. And there we talk about two states with power. But when it comes to Romani people, first of all, going back to Trujillo, we do not have archives. We did not participate in the making of archives, history, and all that. So this this relationship, this dance between power and knowledge production has always been there. Knowledge production has a key role in maintaining these systems in place. And I think that I am not surprised that our history is not there. This is where I insist a lot on the history of slavery, because I wanted it to be known as a system of racialized slavery, first of all. And second of all, we have to acknowledge that it has started before many other systems of oppression, including the history of colonialism, if you think about, and before the history of the transatlantic slave trade more precisely. So I think it's important to contribute to that knowledge, and I think that many of us in Romania, Maria Dumitru, Julius, Rostaș, Petre Petcuț, Delia Grigore, many of us are working on this, Adrian Furtună, Luisa Medelanu, and so on. Now, in terms of methodology, and more so the combination of archive, literature, theories, and critical fabulation, that wasn't an easy choice, right? And it didn't, as you know, as a writer, it is not easy for a scholar to go on that path. Now, I wrote this book for us, for our people. So it wasn't so much important for me to publish it in the best press in the world. The book was rejected by several university presses because of that combination. And in negotiations, you can take out the letter to my nephew or the chapter about the marriage of my great grandparents, but that wasn't, the book would not have been what it is without that. So for me, from the start, this book was more so for us, through our lenses, through the history of my family, and that was something that I was not ready to compromise. And it was impossible for me to tell the story of the wedding of my great-grandparents. I didn't even have a picture of it. So critical fabulation is not my invention. Sebi talked about this earlier. Many other Black feminist scholars have used this melt between reality and imagination to reconstruct stories of slavery and stories from the past. And this, it is truth in that, because I grew up in the same village where they got married. So for me to reconstruct that episode wasn't that hard, because I could recognize the streets where they grew up. I could recognize the smell of the trees and the road. I can see it, I can imagine it. So I use that, and I don't shy away from it. I don't know how scholarly the book is, and honestly, I don't expect any validation from the Gajikano world, and I'm going to be very blunt about it. Now, Gajoness versus whiteness. In the book, I present Gajoness as a shade of whiteness, but at the same time, I think that the relationship between Romani people and Europeans is not one that is the same with whiteness and Blackness. I think that is a very direct hierarchy. So it's Roma and white Europeans more so than Roma and these categories of races that we think of from the constructions of races. Now, racialization, and I see Sebi wanted to add something, and just give me a second. I think that racialization and typologies, particularly looking through the lenses of slavery, I think that this has really impacted a lot the way that I was thinking about racialization as a permanent process, which didn't, it started in those times, but it is continued. And it reinforces and changes all the time. There are some elements there. Romani people have never been similar in terms of phenotype, and we are such a diverse population. So the way that we have been not only categorized, but also hierarchized did not include only phenotype. It has included our names, it has included our dialects, and so much more. So the racialization, when I look at categorization, I do not look only at phenotype. I add all these elements, and more so is this form of absolute racialization. So one thing is to be, placed in a hierarchy between humans, and the other thing is to be outside of that hierarchy and to be seen as property, as object, as non-being. So I really look at the idea of humanity versus non-humanity, and humans versus non-human, and that's where it leads me to the caste system. So when I was reading Isabel Wilkerson's work on caste as a global phenomenon, and then my friend's book, Suraj Yende's book on caste, also as a global phenomenon, I could see so many similarities in the way in which these human hierarchies that they were talking about were similar to the hierarchies that we see in Romania. Let's take that case, because you're talking about slavery. Nobody, theorizes that moment in time, feudalism as a caste system. But if you were to look at Cogolnicianu and others, back in the days, and the boyar that, Maria Dumitru and I interviewed a few years ago, they all talking about this hierarchy, right? You have the aristocracy, and then you have the boyars, and then the peasants, the serfs, and then outside of this hierarchy, you have Romani people who are impure, untouchable, and all that. Now, finally, I do talk about privilege, and I do accept the idea of solidarity. I actually talk about solidarity quite often, particularly in thinking about revolts and revolutions that were, going on between during the spring revolutions in Europe, and we see many moments when peasants and Romani people rebel against aristocracy in Romania. And Cogolnicianu was a former enslaver. He then became the most well-known abolitionist, and many others too. So there has been solidarity, but we cannot really think about privilege as power. So I see power as something totally different than having privilege. And probably to clarify that more clearly, peasants and serfs in Romania had more privilege than enslaved Romani people. First of all, they had land. Their children were not taken away from them. From that perspective, there is a limited privilege. Did peasants have power during feudalism? They didn't. Now, were they oppressed by the upper castes? They were, because they were part of a similar system. It's just that they were taught that they were superior to Romani people, so that these revolts do not come together in solidarity. And this is something that we see today. Isn't it the same recipe in our systems of oppression today? Racialized communities and communities who have traditionally been oppressed are also split into hierarchies. We look at other groups from a perspective of superiority, and others look at us from that same lens. So this is how power and oppression function. This is not a breach in oppression. These paradoxes are part of the systems of oppression. Orlando Peterson talk about the paradoxes of oppression quite a bit.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you so much for responding to what you heard. If we have more comments, both from Ismail and Sebi,
Sebi had her hand.
Yes, I think that will be great to continue the conversation. So, Sebi?
Yes. First of all, I want to say thank you that you didn't accept to take out the letter to Matei from the book, because for us, that letter to Matei means a lot, because it's a letter through which you not only teach Matei to regain his humanity in his own way and to be proud of it, but this letter is a letter to all Roma, to all Roma parents, and it's a letter that I would, and I'm gonna read to Sofia, because the words that your mom said to you, no, to put the Gajikane mask, is something that all of us unfortunately went through, no, with the idea that, you know, this is the way to suffer less or to be integrated more in the Gajikane world. I think that one of the most important point for me in this book is this invitation. How do we think about new humanity? Specifically, how do we think about regaining our own humanity that have been taken from us throughout century, and it's still being taken, no? And it is being taken in modern ways. And when I'm referring to modern ways, I'm referring specifically to the critique you beautifully write, which is the critique to the integration policies that unfortunately have co-opted us for a very long time. No, you write in the letter to Mate, you say, you and we were not born guilty, and we do not have to act guilty because of the color of our skin, our origins, culture, heritage, or who we are. Never shy away from your heritage. Do not doubt yourself because of your Romanescence. Rather, question the inhumanity around you, no? And you urge Mate, and you urge all of us to see the beauty in our reflection, to understand that Europe's treatment of Roma reveals more about Europe's brutality than about Roma humanity. To hold into his dignity even when the world tried to strip it away, you know? So I think that this is the most important invitation that through this book you do to us. You invite us to think about humanity. How do we build a new way of humanity, no? Surrounded in politics specifically about Roma, that is constructed with this idea of Roma exceptionality, Roma exceptionality, Roma politics. No, Roma have their own integration policy, so let them do their thing, right? So we are completely excluded from the global thinking. The Roma suffering does not form part of the global thinking about race, racism, Europe. And here the question is, can we really think about Europe without considering, no, what Roma and Roma suffering played role in the construction of Europe and in the maintenance of Europe nowadays, right? Because of that racialization, no, constantly through different mechanisms that you beautifully bring in this book. So I think this is the great invitation to us to think about humanity, especially because it invites us, no, it makes us realize that no matter how much they scream to us that if we will be integrated, we're going to have a better life, it proves, no, once again that it doesn't work. It works only for us to justify their violence toward us. So what this invites us is to understand that we cannot reform the system because the system is not reformable, unfortunately, no. So we also should shift our thinking that if we are part of the system, we can fix the system. For others, for white, for the power, the system is not broken. It works to its perfection because it is created to function like this through the racialization of the racialized people. So no, this tells to us that we can only build new humanity when we accept that no one can give us our humanity, only we can regain back our humanity, and we can regain back our humanity through our self-determination. And that if we want to build humanity, then we have to to get out of the idea that we can fix the system. We need to build another system. Now, how we do it and so on, it's another discussion. And I think that one of the other key point here is your call in solidarity with other racialized, oppressed group. I think this is key. Unfortunately, we have been excluded for too long from the global thinking. I think that Roma suffering has been invisible for too long because of many reasons, and I think that it is also a duty to us to bring our truth, our history from our knowledges into the global agenda, and also to start to make health accountable those that are still excluding us from the global thinking, policies, academics, anti-racist struggles, everyone. That's it for now.
Thank you so much, Sebi. That was very inspiring. I can confirm that the letter also touched me, and it will be a resource that I will use it in my family, teaching and reading it to my own nephews, to Andrei, to Pavel, to Hector. Three Romani kids who are racialized and who are growing up in a segregated school, in a segregated neighborhood, and whom their life will be determined by who they are. So thank you for that. I would like to ask Ismael if he would like to have some reflections, comments. So Ismael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Magda about the notion of institutional architecture, and of course the trafficking of Romanian slaves, and the traffic of and the market of slaves is in itself an institution. Yeah, and this is an easy object of study that Magda herself analyzed very carefully in her book. And now my question is, how does she see this institutional architecture is reproducing anti-Roma racism in nowadays, yeah, in the current times? And the second question related to this one is about Gajigane politics and policy making, and how does she envision any alternative, either to make a different type of politics or to enter that terrain and negotiate from within, if it's possible at all.
I'll try to answer briefly to these questions, and I think that a lot of inspiration about my thinking about liberal systems and how they function or not for our people come on one hand from my experience in working with Romani Cris, an organization that focused on human rights and individual cases of human rights violations against Romani people, but also the work of Charles Mills, who puts a critique on liberal systems per se. And I bring this two in conversation because very often in my work with Romani Cris, we would try to go, in a school, Romani children are segregated. You represent in court one or two families, and then that 60% of Romani children are placed in similar schools. So the legal systems that we have in place are not meant to deal with collective injustices, with injustices that have continuities and that are interconnected. And that's why the structural nature of anti-Romani racism for me is not just about its historical, traces, but is more so about interactions between all levels and all areas of life. So how do you address in a Western system that focuses on individual rights, collective injustices? And the answer is not in the system that we have. We need a new world, and that world is one where these continuities and legacies and also new ways of racializing and oppressing people are being addressed right away. How we can be part of that system is really a redistribution of power. Is it utopia? It is, but all big ideas start with utopic thinking. if we try to fix this system, as Sebi put it, we've tried for 30 years. I was, I critiqued the integration policies, but I was very much engaged in, in those moments of developing these strategies. I was thinking that we would make it. I believed in the integration project until I didn't. So I cannot, I don't remove myself from the critique. I was part of the system pushing for those policies. Now is is racism part of a whole infrastructure and architecture, one that in the case of Romania is built in slavery? I think that yes, and it hasn't changed much. I mean, we are talking about a long moment of feudalism in these territories, but was really feudalism replaced by something new, or did capitalism has continued, these systems of exploitation with a new name? And it's again not just me. Cedric Robinson, Robin Kelly, and many others talk about these transitions, and there are scholars now talking about neo-feudalism, right? We see it very clearly. We have exploited and exploiters, and that's the reality of it in many ways. So I do think that racism is built in the architecture of the country and in the building of the country. Romania, it would not be what it is today without this long history and the contributions of Roma people. The foundational, contribution of Romani people to the construction of what is Romania today is nowhere, but it's been foundational in the 1848 revolutions, in the the whatever Romanians call the unification of the principalities, and what is democracy today. We cannot ignore the Romani people who have been beaten by the people called by the president of Romania in the early 1990s to cancel a protest. So Roma people have been everywhere, have been part of the resistance, but never really, acknowledged from that. Now, quickly about the reproduction of the past into present. When I talk about these underpinnings of anti-Romani racism, and I mentioned apartness and racialization and bodily violence, I look at it from them from the perspective of continuity. So these are for me on one hand the foundations, but also what keeps this system in place. So if you look at, I'll take apartness, which is basically separation. During slavery in Romania, Romani people were not allowed to marry Gage. Sometimes they are not allowed to marry, other Romani people as well. They were not allowed to marry peasants and all that. So there was a regulation of marriages that was, part of the system. Can we talk about that today from a legal standpoint? No. But if you look at, I think, surveys and all that, I think Agenția Împreună may have had a survey a few years ago, and the majority of Romanians, ethnic Romanians, Gage, would not marry a Roma person. Is that the same? It's not. It's different. It's new, but it's still a reproduction of that moment. Expulsions and entry bans. Haven't we had that forever across Europe? We are not, we do not have the power to kill. If you go, back to the idea of the sovereign and the power to kill of the sovereign. But now national security laws, think about Italy and the laws that allowed local governments to basically expel Roma people and all, to basically not follow the law, were under the veil of national security laws. So we have different ways to survey and to punish Romani people, more modern, right? More modern in so many ways, and that applies to any other pattern that we see throughout the history of Romani people. And this is what I try to do in the book, to look at categories and patterns, or to create categories and patterns. Now, we all know that creating categories is not always, great. I think that there are like 5 other, categories that we could add: racialization and patterns and all that. And some of them are very local, very localized. So there is room for it, but I was trying to make this argument that there is permanence in the system of oppression, and it takes various forms.
Thank you so much. And I really love and enjoy this conversation. I am definitely learning a lot, and I would love to contribute later on. But I was thinking to open maybe the floor to the audience. We perhaps have some questions before we also read the proclamation and mention a couple of words about it. So we have indeed 2 questions from the public, and allow me to read it for you. So, what are the advantages and disadvantages of strategic essentialism within the Romani movement? That would be one question. And a second question would be, how does the idea of cultural Romani authenticity or an authentic Romani dialect might contribute to anti-Roma racism? So do you think, Magda, you can respond to this? Thank you so much.
I would love to briefly, and I would really love to hear Sebi's thoughts and Ismail's thoughts as well on this. I do not believe that strategic essentialism is the way for us, and also, thinking about a particular Roma dialect or something else as the main argument for us to push the agenda forward. I do not believe much in ethnocentrism. And I think it's dangerous in many ways. And just thinking about this idea of strategic essentialism, it takes me closer to that phenomenon. And we've seen it that it doesn't work. It's harmful. If you think about Israel and the genocide of Palestinians today, that might be, a dangerous path for us to take. But do we have, some commonalities? And in the book, I don't ask the question of who we are, for instance. I ask the question of who can we become? And I ask that question because I think there are many elements in our history that are essential for this world. The fact that we do not necessarily think about borders and nation states as, something that we, and this is, I'm actually essentializing, but we are not a group with a state and with borders. So in that sense, we don't necessarily value that nation state construction. This is a construction of of modernity to a large extent. So I think as there is so much for us to offer as a global diaspora, there is so much to offer for us as to the world in terms of how a group that doesn't have these ethno-nationalist symbols from a country to to borders and all that can actually continue keeping their history and their culture alive. So the fact that we exist and we still consider ourselves Roma, it's a big lesson for the world that has been built on nationalism and violence and ethnocentrism. So probably that's our contribution, and that's how I would frame it in this context. Now, even the whole idea of nomadism, which was for such a long time been somehow pushed towards us as a cultural element, and that's something that was inferior to the others. Now we have all these digital nomadic people, and the whole world is thinking in a different way about practices that they previously considered inferior. So it's again the West that brings a new wave that functions for them, and then it's not inferior anymore.
Thank you, Magda. Any of you want to reflect on the questions, Ismail, Sebi? Yeah, so
Yes.
Sebi.
I would love to share very shortly so I don't take too much time my thought. I think of course it is important to think on some cultural aspects for us as Roma internally and so on, but I think that because of the political context that we are in, because of the normalization of the anti-Roma racism, or because of that normalization of the structural violence that we face globally, I think that the urgent question to us, and when I say to us, I refer to Roma and also to the racialized struggle globally, is to think, how do we become a political subject of matter? Because for too long we have been explained, written by the white power, no, with the idea that the colonized, the racialized cannot define themselves, they cannot organize themselves politically. So our political identity has been stolen from us. So now the question, I mean, for me at least, the urgent question is, how do we regain back our political autonomy? How do we become a political subject? As Magda questions in her book, how can we become, right? For me, how can we become is thought, or I'm thinking it in a political matter. And when I think about it in a political matter, I don't think about how do we become a political party or, you know, more partization, but how do we become a political matter of a discussion, not only in Europe, but globally. No, it goes also back to my last intervention. So for me, as I said, it's how do we regain back our self determination, self identification, and how do we become a political autonomous that is not framed and controlled by the system, because we need this autonomy. And I think that, as Magda mentioned, right, Europe and the global world has a lot to learn also from us in terms of resistance. No, for centuries we had an entire system against us that tried to eliminate us, but they did not succeed, and they will not. And because we have our internal tools that have, and they are still allowing us to survive.
Thank you so much, Sebi. Ismail, is anything you would like to reflect or comment?
So there is a distinction that Magda made between power and privilege. And I wonder what is the power that underprivileged people can hold, yeah, of any kind. And I think identity is one of these kind of power that underprivileged people can hold by their own. Yeah? And that's why the history of the Roma has been erased from Romania and in the entire Europe, yeah? Because they know, yeah, in this racial struggle and racial clash, that identity is a source of power. Yeah, and I think this is very clear for all of us. Yeah, and this was somehow one of the drivers of Magda to write this book. Yeah, to discover her own identity that is part of the common identity of the Romani people in Europe, and somehow this give her power and give power to the entire community. Yeah, this kind of self-discovery to strengthen the identity of the Romani people. Of course, with all the diversity, global diaspora, whatever, but this is a source of power. Now, how to use it? Yeah, I don't know how much this should go into an essentialist approach or not. Yeah, and I'm not in the capacity to enter into that terrain, but I do think that the issue of identity, yeah, and to strengthen our own identity, whether through the means of history, through the means of language itself, through the means of culture, art, literature, I think there is a lot to do there. Yeah, And they feel under threat when we do that. Yeah, they do feel under threat, and that's why they try to keep aside certain chapters from Magda book. That's why they try not to give access to us to certain political, cultural, academic, intellectual spaces, because they do know that if they open even a little space, we are going to grow as a community, as a people. That would be my opinion, my answer.
Thank you so much, Ismail. These are great reflections. So Magda, if you want to have maybe a couple of reflections before we say goodbye to our discussants and move to the proclamation, now is the moment. So.
First of all, I want to thank you all, Maria Dumitru and Fernando, who is behind the screen and has done this amazing job at organizing and having a vision for this whole event. So thank you both. And of course, Ismail and Sebi, for your comments and critique and questions. I'm so grateful, and I've learned a lot today. I think, the question of identity and essentialism, and that probably is something that we are all taking with us back home and rethink. I think for a long time we've had moments when some Romani leaders went to India hoping to regain land, right? What is it to be a global diaspora? Even our realities and experiences are not included in the theories of global diasporas. What is it really, identity, especially in a time today when Roma, Sinti, Kale, Manusha, and all these groups are in a moment of closeness by, framing broader umbrellas, but also in a moment of tension, and very often these tensions are East versus West. And racialized poverty versus less of it. So I think there is so much to think about this whole idea of identity and how you can use it strategically, but at the same time I'm not really a post-colonial theorist, and I don't believe in in those theories much. But I feel that that's probably one question that many Romani leaders will have to continue thinking about it, and continue thinking about it with Romani people, in Romani neighborhoods, in Romani families, because that's where identity really happens.
Thank you so much for this, Magda. So overall, dear guest, thank you so much for being with us. It was such a pleasure. I appreciated your kind time to respond to this amazing book. And it was such a great pleasure to have three Romani scholars here from the critical thinking, whom I admire, and I quote you in my work. And I really hope that we will do this kind of discussions and conversations face to face very soon. So thank you so much, Ismail. Thank you so much, Sebi, for being with us. And I wish you a lovely evening.
Thank you, Maria. It was a pure pleasure to share this afternoon with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for putting us together. It's a pleasure to see Magda and Sebi after a long time. Hope to see you soon in person.
Thank you so much. And now, thank you so much, Magda, for remaining with us. We are very happy to continue. Before finishing, we mentioned that today we also have a proclamation to mention about, a proclamation that it was initiated by a doctor and our historian Petre Petcuț. It's about slavery reparation, recognition, and truth-telling. Both myself and Magda contributed in crafting 22 demands of the proclamation alongside other Romani scholars such as PhD candidate Oana Rusu, Dr. Delia Grigore, Dr. Liliana Ene, Dr. Maria Bogdan, and Dr. Julius Rostas. So I was thinking, Magda, that our viewers maybe can learn a little bit more about this Romani proclamation. So I will kindly invite you to speak 1 minute about what is the meaning of this Roma proclamation.
Thank you so much. I would probably shortly talk about the initiative itself. It's interesting that back in October last year, we had a chance to meet with Petre Petkuc in Oslo, and this amazing historian had already prepared a proclamation that he was thinking to launch today at the anniversary of 170 years of freedom from enslavement in Romania. And we sat down one evening, it was actually night until early, morning, and we looked at this proclamation together with all the scholars that Maria Dumitru mentioned, and eventually we came up with a proclamation that has about 22 points, and you can all see them on the screen, and I don't want to take your time with it, but what is important about this proclamation is that it really demands the official recognition of Roma slavery as a crime against humanity. It asks for the digitization of all archives concerning the slavery of Romani people. It asked for memorial sites where Roma were held in slavery and so much more. So these are 22 points. And in order to sign the proclamation, you can either go directly to the petition, which is available on change.org, or you can visit the website Roma Proclamation 2026, and you can see there not only the history of this proclamation, but also the history of these 170 years of freedom. And you can find the proclamation in Romanes, French, Romanian, and English. And you can also just click sign the proclamation after you read all 22 points. And I do want to, thank Maria Bogdan for building this beautiful website for this important work. As well as Gabriela Nenciu. So thank you, and I think that's it on my side. But Maria Dumitru, I'll just pass the floor to you to add anything that I may have missed.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, I think you said everything. I would just like to mention that the viewers and people following us will find the proclamation on our social media, CHANIPEN, Research, Memory and Justice, and there they can sign it, they can share it, they can read it and learn about it. And it was such a great opportunity for us to build and create something political, but also historical, to have so many Romani scholars working on this. But of course, the honor and the merit comes to Petre Petkuc, who is the initiator of this proclamation. So I think that was before saying goodbye to our viewers. I will say goodbye to you, Magda. It was such a interesting discussion. I am really happy that you were here today with us. I've definitely learned a lot, and I think people watching us, they also did. And I truly think that people will read your work, as this is a significant contribution in the anti-racism scholarship, not just on the Romani perspective, but also globally. And thank you so much for being with us today. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now that we said goodbye to our guests, to our authors, I would just like to mention that this event was part of our Meet Our History campaign organized by our organization CHANIPEN, Research, Memory and Justice. And we do plan to have many other live events and interesting discussion, all in sharing Romani history and Romani perspectives, Romani voices, and Romani important aspects of us. So today we had the pleasure to launch the Permanence of Anti-Racism book, and I really hope that people watching us will have the book, will read it, will study, will criticizing, and most of all will share it among everyone. So thank you once again. Follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.